The sentence: the dusty winds swept across the arid landscape of the Arizona Territory, carrying with them the bitter scent of dried sage and the distant echoes of a restless land. It was the spring of 1882, a time when the frontier was still wild, dangerous, and raw, where the clash between settlers and native tribes had become an endless story of bloodshed and heartbreak. Nalene, a young Apache woman, sat quietly on a rough-hewn wooden bench inside the tiny courthouse of a dusty frontier town called Red Rock. The walls were stained with smoke and sweat, the floor littered with chips of splintered wood and bits of dirt tracked in by rough boots. The townsfolk packed the room, their faces hard and unforgiving beneath wide-brimmed hats. The air was thick with tension, their whispers a low hum of anticipation. Nolene's dark eyes scanned the crowd with calm defiance. Her long black hair was braided tightly down her back, adorned with small feathers and beads, tokens of her heritage and her people's reverence for the earth and sky. Despite the verdict hanging heavily in the air, she remained composed, as if the verdict itself was just another story the wind would carry away. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The judge, a portly man with a ruddy face and a quick temper, pounded his gavel against the bench. The court finds Nalene guilty of aiding and abetting an Apache raid against the settlers' outpost near Black Mesa, he declared. His voice echoed through the courtroom, cold and final. Sentence: death by hanging at dawn. A ripple of cheers and jeers swept through the crowd. Some spat on the floor. Others raised their fists in satisfaction. The fear of the Apache raids had carved deep scars into their hearts, and justice, or what passed for justice, was swift and merciless. Nalene's fate was sealed by the mere color of her skin and the whisper of old fears, as the judge droned on about the evidence, which was, in truth, little more than hearsay and accusations from a handful of frightened settlers. Nalene said nothing. She had never been given a fair chance to explain. The truth was more complicated. She had indeed tended to the wounded after the raid, but only because she was a healer, a bearer of her people's ancient knowledge of herbs and medicine. She was no killer, no conspirator. Yet none of that mattered here. From the back of the courtroom, a lone figure watched the proceedings with clenched fists and eyes burning with anger and disbelief. John Merrick was a man of few words, a cattle rancher who had lived on the fringes of the Apache lands for years. He was known to be rough around the edges, a Civil War veteran who carried the ghosts of battle beneath his skin, but also a man of honor who respected the land and its people. He remembered the day Nolan had saved his life. It had been 3 years earlier, when a wild stallion had thrown him violently against a rock during a cattle roundup. His leg was broken, and infection had set in, threatening to take him from this world. Nalene had found him, tended to his wounds with care and skill, and nursed him back to health in her small camp. The bond formed in those difficult weeks had been unspoken but profound. Now, seeing her sentenced to death for a crime she did not commit, Merrick's heart burned with fury and resolve. As the judge banged the gavel to end the trial, Merrick rose from his seat in the back, his voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. "This isn't justice. Nalene is innocent." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. "You're condemning a healer for something she did to help her people survive." The sheriff stepped forward, his hand hovering near his holstered revolver. "Step down, Merrick. This court's made its decision." But Merrick was undeterred. "I won't stand by and watch a good woman die because of fear and hate." He turned his gaze to Nalene, who met his eyes with a flicker of hope, the faintest sign that she believed in him. "I'm going to make sure you live." Outside, the sun began its slow descent behind the red cliffs, casting long shadows across the town. The verdict would be carried out at dawn. But Merrick already knew that when the first light broke, everything would change. The court adjourned with the final clang of the gavel, and the crowd spilled out into the street, voices raised in heated debate. Some were angry at Merrick's outburst. Others whispered rumors of the rancher's strange alliance with the Apache. But Merrick's mind was already racing ahead, to plans, risks, and the impossible task of saving a woman condemned, not by truth but by fear. As the courthouse emptied, Nalene remained seated for a moment, eyes fixed on the worn floorboards. The cold weight of death pressed down on her, yet inside burned a quiet flame, a hope that someone, somewhere, believed in justice beyond the law of the gun. John Merrick stepped outside into the cooling evening air. He looked up at the stars, beginning to prick the sky, and whispered, "I'll be back for you, Nalene, I swear it." The frontier was ruthless, but so was he. The rancher's resolve. The sun had almost disappeared behind the jagged horizon when John Merrick rode back to his isolated ranch on the outskirts of Apache territory. The chill of dusk crept into the air, carrying with it a quiet sense of urgency that gnawed at his thoughts. Naline's fate weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder that justice was a fragile thing in this unforgiving land. Merrick's ranch was a rugged place, a stretch of sun-baked earth dotted with hardy sagebrush and tall, weathered mesquite trees. His house was a sturdy wooden cabin, walls thick enough to hold out the desert wind and nights cold enough to make the stars burn brighter. But the land was more than his home. It was where he had built his life from scratch after the war, a place where he learned to live alongside the land and sometimes alongside its people. He tied his horse to the post outside and went inside, where a single oil lamp flickered. He sat down at the rough pine table, running his hands over the worn leather of his saddlebag. Inside were a few essentials: a rifle, some extra ammunition, a coil of rope, and a small, worn book Naline had once given him, a guide to the herbs and remedies of the Apache. Merrick had spent years learning from the Apache, listening to their stories, their ways, their wisdom. It was a rare bond between two worlds that most men tried to keep apart. For him, Naline was more than a healer. She was a symbol of a better understanding, a bridge between two sides of the same harsh land. Now, she was marked for death because of prejudice and fear. He poured himself a cup of strong coffee and stared into the dark. There was no easy way to save her, not from a town thirsting for vengeance, not from a system that saw her as the enemy. But Merrick was a man who had fought wars and survived battles. He wasn't about to let injustice claim another victim on his watch. The first step was to plan. Merrick knew the courthouse well. The layout of the town was simple, but the jail was a small, grim building near the center, guarded day and night by deputies who saw their job as protecting the town from savage threats. The idea of breaking Naline out seemed impossible, yet Merrick had never been a man to shrink from impossible. He pulled on his dusty coat, grabbed his rifle, and stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was clear, and the stars stretched wide overhead like a silent audience to his resolve. He mounted his horse and rode toward the edge of the town, where the adobe walls of the jail loomed like a dark fortress. Approaching quietly, Merrick studied the guards. 2 deputies sat near the front gate, their rifles resting across their laps, dozing in the fading warmth of the night. He counted their movements, timing his approach. The jail was old, built with thick stone and iron bars. But Merrick knew, a secreter narrow tunnel beneath the town, dug during a brief gold rush years before, now long abandoned and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in an old mining office near the jail. He slipped silently into the shadows. Making his way to the mining office, the door creaked faintly as he pushed it open, but the cool desert air swallowed the sound. Kneeling, he found the loose floorboard and pried it up carefully, revealing a narrow crawl space leading underground. The tunnel smelled of dust and decay, but it was the only way in. With his rifle slung over his shoulder, Merrick crawled through the dark passage, his heart pounding but his mind clear. The tunnel twisted and turned beneath the town's streets, emerging just behind the jailhouse walls. He climbed out carefully, brushing off dirt as he moved toward the small barred window of the cell where Naline was held. Inside, Naline sat on a wooden bench, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Her eyes caught the glint of moonlight and met Merrick's through the bars. There was no surprise, only a quiet acceptance mixed with the faintest flicker of hope. "You came," she whispered. "I'm getting you out," he said, voice low but steady. "We don't have much time before dawn." Naline nodded, standing gracefully despite the thin blanket around her shoulders. Merrick pulled a small set of lockpicks from his pocket, tools he'd acquired during the war. With careful hands, he worked the iron lock until it clicked open. The cell door swung quietly ajar. "Be ready to move fast," he warned together. They slipped into the shadows, Merrick supporting Naline as they hurried through the back alleyways. The town was waking, but most people were still asleep. They avoided the main streets, sticking to the narrow paths between buildings and fences. Once outside the town limits, Merrick slowed his horse and looked at Naline. "You're safe for now," he said, though the reality was far from it. She gave a faint smile. "Thank you, John. You risk much for a stranger." "You're not a stranger to me," he said quietly. "You saved me once. Now it's my turn." They rode into the desert night, 2 figures bound by a fragile trust and a shared hope. But danger still lurked close behind them, the angry posse. That would stop at nothing to bring Naline back, dead or alive. As the cold wind brushed across the plains, Merrick knew the hard part was just beginning. To save Nalin he would have to fight not only the men hunting her but the hatred that poisoned the land itself. And he was ready. The escape the desert night wrapped around John Merrick and Nalin like a cloak as they rode away from Red Rock, their horses' hooves barely making a sound on the dry earth. The stars above were brilliant. The Milky Way stretched like a silver ribbon across the endless sky. Yet the beauty of the night could not dull the urgency beating in Merrick's chest. Behind them, the town of Red Rock slowly stirred. The jail's unlocked cell door was discovered soon after dawn, sending shockwaves through the community. The sheriff, a hard-faced man with a cruel streak, was furious and immediately called for a posse to track down the escapees. The reward for Nalin's captured dead or alive was posted in every saloon, on every storefront. Merrick knew time was running out. The desert was vast, but so was the determination of the hunters. He looked at Nalin as they pushed forward, her face calm, almost stoic. She knew the land in ways he never could. Every rock, every creek, every hidden trail was familiar to her. Merrick trusted her instinct to guide them through the peril. They kept to the shadows and moved mostly at night, resting by day in shaded gullies or caves. The blistering sun was relentless, but the desert held secrets, and Nalin shared her knowledge of hidden springs and edible plants. They drank sparingly, but Merrick's mind was consumed not by thirst, but by the relentless chase. On the third day, as they crossed a narrow canyon, Merrick noticed the signs of broken twig, faint hoofprints pressed into soft soil. The posse was close. They had been following the trail steadily, their thirst for vengeance growing with every mile. "We're not alone," Merrick said quietly. Nalin nodded, her eyes scanning the rocky edges. "They follow, but we know the land better. We can lose them if we choose." Merrick frowned. "But the town won't stop. They want to make an example of you. That's why we can't stay in one place too long," she replied. "But I have a plan." For centuries, the Apache had used the rugged terrain to their advantage, knowing every ravine, every bluff, every hiding place where even horses couldn't follow. Nalin led Merrick off the main trail, deeper into rough country where the land rose sharply and the terrain became treacherous. The ride grew slower, the horses struggling to keep footing on narrow paths lined with loose stones. Merrick's arms ached as he guided his mount carefully, trusting Nalin's steady hand. After hours of grueling travel, they reached a high plateau spirit bluffer place, sacred to Nalin's people. "This is where we stand," she said, softly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "They will come, but this ground is ours." The bluff overlooked a vast stretch of desert, cliffs dropping sharply into deep canyons below. It was a natural fortress, hard to approach, and easy to defend. Merrick felt a strange calm in the place, as if the land itself was watching over them. That evening, they prepared their defenses. Merrick set traps, simple but effective, rolling rocks to block narrow paths, snares hidden among the brush, and tripwires rigged with bells and loose stones to alert them of any approach. Nalin gathered herbs and roots, using them to treat their sore muscles and bruised skin, and to mask their scent from pursuers. As darkness fell, they built a small fire, the flames flickering against the backdrop of towering cliffs. Merrick's thoughts churned as he stared into the blaze. He had never been in a fight like this before. This wasn't war between armies, but a desperate battle against hatred and fear. Saving Nalin was no longer just about one life. It was about standing for something larger: justice, compassion, and the hope of peace. Nalin broke the silence. "You risk everything for me," she said, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Why?" Merrick shrugged. "Because I owe you. And because it's the right thing to do." She smiled faintly. "Then we fight together." Their moment of peace was shattered by a sudden noise, hooves pounding on the rocky trail below. The posse had found them. Merrick grabbed his rifle, heart pounding. "Get ready." The men appeared like shadows against the moonlit desert, armed and angry, their faces twisted with rage and fear. They shouted Nalin's name, their voices carrying across the canyon. Merrick shouted back, his voice strong and clear, "She is innocent. You're chasing a lie." The posse hesitated, but the sheriff's barked orders pushed them forward. Rocks tumbled down the bluff, some striking horses, others forcing the men to take cover. The traps Merrick had set slowed their advance, forcing the posse to rethink their approach. Up on the bluff, Nalin raised her arms, calling out in Apache, her voice strong and haunting. The desert seemed to respond. The wind rose, stirring dust and dry leaves, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The posse faltered, spooked by the sudden storm gathering on the horizon. Horses reared and neighed nervously. The sheriff cursed. under his breath, but ordered a retreat. As the men withdrew, Merrick and Nalin stood side by side, breathing hard but alive. "This land is ours," Nalin said quietly, "and we will protect it." Merrick nodded, knowing the fight was far from over, but here, on Spirit Bluff, they had found a fragile sanctuary, one they would defend with every ounce of courage and strength. The hunt tightens. The morning sun spilled over the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across Spirit Bluff. Merrick and Nalin woke to a quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air like the heavy scent of rain before a storm. The brief victory from the night before had bought them time, but Merrick knew the posse wouldn't give up easily. They were chasing more than a woman. They were chasing fear, hatred, and a need for revenge. For days, the pair stayed high on the bluff, moving cautiously between rocky outcrops and narrow ledges. Nalin's knowledge of the land was their greatest weapon. She knew where water pooled beneath stones, where the coyotes and mountain lions made their dens, and how to read the whispers of the wind. Merrick, for his part, kept watch with a sharp eye, his rifle always close. Despite the beauty around them, the wildflowers clinging stubbornly to the cliffs, the soaring hawks circling overhead, the weight of pursuit pressed on their minds. The desert was no longer just a home. It was a battleground. The posse, however, was relentless. Led by Sheriff Harlan, a man whose face was etched with scars, both physical and moral, the hunters regrouped in the town below. The sheriff's fury was a dangerous force. To him, Nalin was a symbol of all the dangers he believed lurked beyond the borders of his town, and capturing her had become an obsession. "Find them," the sheriff commanded, slamming his fist on the table in the makeshift command post. "Bring her back, dead or alive." His men spread out, combing the hills and valleys with practiced precision. Some were townsfolk, hardened by years of frontier life. Others were bounty hunters, strangers, drawn by the promise of reward and violence. Back on Spirit Bluff, Merrick and Nalin had to be constantly vigilant. Each day brought new signs of the posse: broken branches, faint footprints in soft earth, the echo of distant voices carried on the wind. One afternoon, as the sun beat mercilessly down, Merrick spotted movement below a small group of riders, navigating the narrow passes beneath the bluff. "They're closing in," he said, voice low. Nalin nodded, her eyes steady. "We can't stay. Too exposed." The decision was made quickly. They packed their meager belongings and prepared to move under the cover of darkness. Descending the bluff carefully along a hidden trail only Nalin knew, as night fell, the desert transformed. The air cooled, and the stars blazed with an intensity that made the darkness almost tangible. Merrick and Nalin moved swiftly, their horses barely making a sound over the rocky path. But the night held dangers beyond the posse. The desert was home to creatures both magnificent and deadly. As they rounded a bend, a sudden rustle in the brush made Merrick halt. Out of the shadows emerged a large mountain lion, its eyes glowing in the moonlight. The animal crouched, muscles taut, ready to strike. Merrick's rifle was raised in an instant, but Nalin shook her head. "No, it is not an enemy." She stepped forward slowly, speaking in a soft voice. The mountain lion's ears twitched, and after a tense moment, it relaxed, turning and disappearing into the night. Merrick exhaled slowly. "You understand them. They respect strength and respect given," Nalin replied. The brief encounter reminded Merrick of the fine balance they walked between life and death, not only with men hunting them but with nature itself. They pushed on until the first light of dawn, finally stopping at a secluded canyon hidden by towering cliffs. Nalin led Merrick to a small pool fed by a trickling spring, a rare oasis in the desert. As they rested, Merrick considered their next move. The posse was growing bolder, and the townsfolk's anger was turning to fear. If Nalin was captured, it would mean death. But if Merrick failed to protect her, he would lose not only a friend but a symbol of hope in a land too often ruled by fear. That night, around their small fire, Merrick voiced what they both knew. "We can't outrun them forever. They'll come with numbers, with weapons." Nalin's gaze was unwavering. "Then we face them. Not with anger, but with the land on our side." Merrick nodded. "We'll need help." Nalin looked up at the stars, the ancient constellations that her ancestors had watched for generations. "There are others who remember the old ways," she said. "If we find them, they will stand with us." The days ahead would be the hardest yet. Merrick and Nalin had escaped the town, but now they would need allies in a world that had turned against them. As the fire crackled and the desert night sang its quiet song, Merrick felt a fierce determination ignite within him. He would risk everything to protect Nalin, not just from death, but from the hatred that had sentenced her before the truth could be heard. Allies in the shadows. The days stretched long and restless as John Merrick and Nalin moved quietly through the rugged landscape beyond Spirit Bluff. The desert sun bore down with an unforgiving heat, and the nights brought a bitter chill that settled into their bones. The chase was relentless, but now they sought more than safety, they needed allies. Nalin spoke little of where they were going. But Merrick trusted her instincts. Her connection to the land was deeper than his, and her people's knowledge could open doors where his might only meet closed fists. One evening, as the sun sank behind the distant mesas, they arrived at a narrow canyon shaded by towering juniper trees. The air smelled of pine and earth, a rare balm to the dry desert. Nalin led Merrick into a hidden cave carved into the rock face, its entrance obscured by hanging vines and brush. Inside, the cool darkness embraced them. Flickering torchlight illuminated the faces of a small group waiting within Apache elders and warriors, their eyes sharp and wary but filled with cautious hope. "Welcome, Nalin," an elder greeted her in their language. His voice was deep, carrying the weight of years. "And you, John Merrick. Your courage precedes you." Merrick inclined his head. "I'm here to help. To protect Nalin and what she stands for." The elders exchanged glances. One spoke. "The land is scarred by blood and fear. To stand against those who hunt you, we must stand together. The Apache do not forget who honors their ways." Nalin nodded. "The settlers do not see me as anything but a threat. But the truth is buried beneath lies and hate." The elders listened, then one stepped forward. A wiry man named Tatsi. "If we are to fight this injustice, we must act carefully. The town's hatred runs deep, but we know the land. We can guide you through paths they do not know." Merrick's relief was tempered by the weight of responsibility. This was more than a rescue mission now. It was a stand against a system built on prejudice. Over the next several days, the group prepared. The elders shared wisdom about the terrain, hidden trails, secret water sources, places where the land itself could defend them. Nalin showed Merrick how to use plants, not only for healing but to mask their scent and confuse trackers. At night, they practiced moving silently, blending with the shadows. Merrick learned to listen to the desert's subtle sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a coyote, the shifting of sand underfoot. But even with allies, danger was never far. One afternoon, scouts reported the posse was closing in. Once again, more men than before, their anger fueled by the growing rumor of Merrick's aid to not. The settlers saw this as an affront to their authority, a challenge that could not stand. That evening, under a blood-red sunset, Merrick and the Apache warriors gathered on a rocky ridge overlooking the narrow valley below. Plans were made to lead the posse into a trap, using the land itself to their advantage. As darkness fell, they moved quietly down the slope, scattering among the rocks and shadows. Merrick's heart hammered in his chest, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the Kenyana rifle shot and chaos erupted. The posse, confident in their numbers, charged forward, shouting and firing wildly. But Merrick and his allies had prepared well. Rocks tumbled down from above, narrowly missing the attackers and blocking narrow escape routes. The Apache warriors moved with swift precision, forcing the posse into a narrow canyon where their horses struggled for footing. Merrick fired carefully, aiming not to kill, but to scare, to buy time. In the confusion, Nalin slipped through the chaos, her knowledge of the terrain unmatched. She led a small group away from the fight, toward a hidden cave she had known since childhood. The battle raged on as Merrick and the warriors held the line. The posse, frustrated and outmaneuvered, began to falter. Some were wounded, others captured. By dawn, the dust settled. Merrick counted the cost: several Apache warriors injured, a few posse men captured, and many more scattered and retreating. But the message was clear: Nalin was not alone, and those who stood with her would fight with every breath. In the quiet aftermath, Merrick sat beside Nalin, her face pale but determined. "We won this day," Merrick said softly, "but the war is far from over." Nalin nodded. "The land remembers. So do we." Their bond, forged in fire and danger, grew stronger. The rancher and the Apache woman were no longer just fugitives, they were symbols of resistance against a world too quick to condemn without understanding. And in the shadowed canyons of the desert, hope flickered brighter than the dawn. The price of justice. The days after the skirmish on the ridge were tense and fraught with uncertainty. Merrick and Nalin, now surrounded by trusted Apache allies, moved cautiously through the desert. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant shout from the town below, reminded them that danger was never far. Yet amidst the peril, Merrick felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. Protecting Nalin wasn't just about defying the posse anymore. It was about standing up for justice in a land that had forgotten what that meant. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but it also held lessons. Merrick learned patience and humility, listening to Nalin's stories of her people's history, tales of resilience, betrayal, and hope. She spoke of a future where both worlds could coexist, if only fear and hatred could be overcome. But that future seemed distant. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with fiery hues, Merrick and Nalin set camp near a quiet spring, the only sound the trickle of water and the soft crackle of their fire. Merrick cleaned his rifle while Nalin prepared a simple meal from wild roots and dried meat. Suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the night. Merrick's hand went to his gun, eyes scanning the darkness. Out of the shadows stepped a young Apache scout, breathless and wide-eyed. "They are coming," he said. "The sheriff leads a larger posse. They have guns, horses, and hatred." Merrick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold desert night. The sheriff was not just hunting Nalin, he was hunting a symbol of change, and he would stop at nothing. They gathered the small group, quickly discussing their options. Retreating deeper into the desert was dangerous, but perhaps the only choice. The journey was grueling. The sun scorched their backs, and water grew scarce. Some of the elders urged caution, knowing the desert could be merciless to the weary. Merrick, however, felt a rising anger. The men hunting Nalin were fueled not by justice, but by fear of what she represented: a challenge to the old order. "We cannot run forever," he said quietly to Nalin one night, staring up at the stars. "We need a way to end this." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "There is a place, a council of tribes. They meet in secret. If they accept us, we may find strength beyond ourselves." The next days were a test of endurance and trust. Guided by the elders, they made their way through hidden paths, crossing canyons and dry riverbeds, avoiding patrols and bandits. Merrick's muscles ached, but his resolve only hardened. At last, they arrived at a secluded valley ringed by ancient cliffs. There, beneath the shadow of towering pines, tribes gathered: Apache, Navajo, Hopi, and others, who still held the old ways sacred. The council was a solemn affair. Elders, speaking in low tones, weighing the fate of a land torn by conflict. Merrick stood before them, speaking with conviction about Nalin's plight and the injustice she faced. He told of the courage of one woman and the hope she inspired. After hours of deliberation, a decision was made. "We will stand with you," the chief declared, his voice echoing through the valley. "Not just as warriors, but as keepers of the land and protectors of justice." The news spread quickly. Word reached Red Rock that Nalin had powerful allies, and the sheriff's once certain pursuit began to waver. But with allies came a new challenge. The fight was no longer just for survival, but for something greater. Merrick understood the price that must be paid. The sheriff, desperate and enraged, escalated his campaign. The town's militia grew more aggressive, setting traps and ambushes. Innocent settlers were caught between fear and loyalty, their trust shattered. One fateful night, the posse attacked the council's camp under cover of darkness. Fires were set, and chaos erupted. Merrick fought fiercely alongside the warriors, defending Nalin and the sacred land. The battle was brutal and heartbreaking. Lives were lost on both sides. Merrick was wounded, a deep cut across his arm, bleeding freely, but his spirit remained unbroken. When dawn broke, the camp lay scarred but standing. The message was clear: they would not yield. As Nalin tended to Merrick's wound, she whispered, "The price of justice is steep, but it is worth every drop of blood." Merrick nodded, the pain sharp but the hope stronger. Their fight had become a Bakuna call to those who believed in a better future. In that fragile moment of quiet after the storm, Merrick and Nalin knew that the road ahead was long and uncertain, but together they would face it. A new dawn. The desert dawn was soft and golden, a quiet contrast to the violence that had shattered the night. Merrick and Nalin sat beside the smoldering remains of the council's camp, the air heavy with loss but also with determination. The battle had taken its toll, friends' lost, wounds still fresh, and the harsh truth that their fight was far from over, but the fire of resistance burned brighter than ever in their hearts. Merrick flexed his injured arm, now wrapped in cloth, and looked out over the valley. "They'll come again," he said. "Stronger, angrier." Nalin nodded, her gaze steady. "Then we will be ready." The council elders met once more to plan. This time, their focus was not only defense but change. They would reach out to neighboring settlements, seek allies among settlers who believed in justice, and build a coalition that could challenge the sheriff's reign. Merrick, once a lone rancher, now found himself a leader. His courage had sparked a movement, one that crossed boundaries of race and history, uniting those who dared to dream of peace. Over the following weeks, messages were sent and received. Some settlers answered with suspicion, others with hope. A few brave souls came forward, offering supplies, shelter, and support. In the town of Red Rock, the sheriff's grip weakened. The law he wielded was no longer absolute. Public opinion shifted as stories of Naline's courage and Merrick's defiance spread like wildfire. One evening, a meeting was arranged. Representatives from the Apache, neighboring tribes, and townsfolk gathered in the small church at the edge of Red Rock. It was tense, cautious, but filled with the possibility of understanding. Naline spoke first. Her voice clear and unwavering. "I am not your enemy," she said. "I am a daughter of this land, as are you. We all suffer when hatred blinds us." Merrick stood beside her, adding, "We seek peace and justice, not vengeance." The sheriff sat among them, his eyes narrowed. For the first time, he faced a community demanding change, a future where fear no longer dictated law. It was not an easy path. Old wounds ran deep, and some voices called for continued hostility. But the seeds of something new had been planted. In the months that followed, tensions eased. Naline and Merrick worked tirelessly, bridging divides, healing scars. The land, once stained with violence, began to feel alive again with hope. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the mesas, Merrick and Naline stood together on Spirit Bluff. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth. The sky, a canvas of orange and purple. "We made it through," Merrick said softly. Naline smiled, the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. "Not just survived. We changed something." He took her hand, feeling the strength that had carried them both through fire and fear. Together, he said, their story became legend, a tale of courage, compassion, and the fight for justice in a land too long divided. And as the desert breathed beneath the endless sky, a new dawn rose, one where hope, like the wildflowers in the desert, bloomed against all odds.